Hey, what's going on, guys? Brian from Zombie Guitar here. What I was just doing there was soloing using the Dorian mode. Okay, so the purpose of this 7-part series is to really differentiate the 7 modes from one another. Okay, so in each of these 7 parts, I want you to really hear what each mode sounds like. So in part 1, we did the Ionian mode, also known as the major scale. The major scale has a happy, uplifting, cheery sound to it, okay? In part 6, you're going to find that we get to the Aeolian mode, also known as the minor scale, and that's going to have a sadder, bluesy type sound, okay? So the Dorian mode now has a different sound than both of those, okay? It has its own unique, specific sound. It is a tonality, okay? So that's the point I'm trying to get across. So in all of these 7 parts, I'm going to be doing A-type modes. Part 1 was A Ionian. This part is A Dorian. Part 3 is going to be A Phrygian. Part 4 is going to be A Lydian, and so on. That way, A is always going to be your tonal center. A is always going to be your home note of whatever you're playing on the fretboard using any pattern or position of the particular mode. A is always going to be what everything is, revolved around. But each one is going to have a different sound. So let's first start off with the scale formula. Okay, so the scale formula for the Dorian mode, let's take it in relationship to the major scale. Okay, so the major scale formula is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so if you want to take that and you want to turn that into the minor scale, you would flatten the 3, the 6, and the 7. The result would be 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7. That's the formula for the minor scale. Okay? If you don't understand what I'm talking about with the scale formula stuff, I linked you to another lesson in which I explain how scales are created using formulas. Okay, so that's your major scale formula and that's your minor scale formula. Now, if you want to make it a Dorian mode, okay, or the Dorian scale, okay, whatever you want to call it, you would simply unflatten the 6th. Okay, so the formula for the Dorian mode would be 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7. So the Dorian mode's formula is very closely related to the formula for the minor scale, the only difference being that 6th note. In the minor scale it's flattened, in the Dorian it's not flattened. Okay, so let's play both back to back in one octave and hear the difference between the two. So here is the A minor scale, also known as the A Aeolian mode. Okay, so now I'm going to change it and I'm going to raise that 6th degree and play the A Dorian mode. Okay, so that's your note right there. That's the key note that gives the Dorian mode its specific unique sound. Alright, so now let's try to play the Dorian mode in 2 octaves and hear how that sounds. Okay, you can hear it's a little more clear when I play it in 2 octaves that there's now a distinct sound being formed, okay? And that 6th note is really what creates this Dorian sound, okay? So that is the formula for the Dorian mode. Now let's get on to some uses for the Dorian mode. Alright, so the Dorian mode is used over minor chords, alright? And the difference between the Dorian mode and the regular minor scale is minor scales and major scales are typically used over entire chord progressions, okay? Entire diatonic chord progressions. So if there's 3, 4, 5 or more chords and all of those chords are within the same key and they're moving in a progression, then if it's a minor key, you would play the minor scale. If it's a major key, then you would play the major scale. The other 5 modes, including the Dorian, are used typically as just a temporary switch. Okay, so if you're playing in either a major key or a minor key and an out-of-key chord gets thrown into that progression and that out-of-key chord happens to be a minor chord, then you could temporarily switch your playing up to the Dorian mode over that one particular chord. Okay? So if whatever, any chord progression's going on and then you happen to notice that a C minor gets thrown into that progression and C minor is not in the key, it's obviously not in the key, well, you can play the Dorian mode over just that C minor chord and it's gonna sound cool. It's gonna work. It's gonna give the playing a reflection of the chord progression, okay? That's one common use of the Dorian mode. Another common use of the Dorian mode is to play it over 1 to 2 chord vamps. Okay, and that's what I was doing in the intro of this video. Alright, so basically what I was doing was I was playing an A minor chord and a D major chord in the intro, and I was soloing over that. Now the reason that the Dorian mode worked over that is because if you think back to your minor keys, in just a regular natural minor key, your 1 chord, your 4 chord, and your 5 chord are all going to be minor. Okay? So if you're in the key of A minor, then the diatonic chords would be A minor, D minor, and E minor. Those 3 chords would be found in the key of A minor. But what I was doing, I was using a D major, okay? So a D major is the 4 chord, okay, but it's major now. And because it's major, I was applying the Dorian mode over that 2 chord vamp, okay? So the 2 chord vamp I was doing went something like this. Alright, so I was soloing over that. Now, the one note that makes that 4 chord major is this note. And that one note is the note that makes the Dorian mode, okay? Okay? So that note is what gives it the sound, and the underlying chord progression, as I said in part 1 and the intro to modes, the underlying chord progression is what dictates what I'm supposed to play. So the fact that this minor chord followed by a 4 chord that was of the major quality, the fact that that progression was going on, that dictated that I should be using the Dorian mode. Alright? So I hope this is making sense. Alright, so it's not a minor key. If it was a minor, purely diatonic minor, then the 4 chord would be minor. Okay, but now it's minor to major. Okay, minor 1, major 4, Dorian mode applies. Alright, so let's just try playing this in just one position over this 2 chord vamp. I have this 2 chord vamp stored in my looper. Alright, Alright, so I'm just going to play right here in this position so you can see what I'm doing and how this Dorian mode is sounding. So I'm going to play using the 3-note per string patterns. And you can go up here too. Okay, so it's going to sound like this. Okay, so I was just playing in that position there, and as you saw, all of the notes worked. Alright, now let me just try to play, for the sake of example, let me just try to play the minor scale over that progression, okay? Let me just try to play the A minor scale. And you're going to hear how the one note that differentiates the minor scale from the Dorian mode is actually going to sound bad in this instance, okay? So let's hear how that sounds. Okay, so I'm really trying to highlight that bad note. That was just the regular A minor scale. Now, it sounded bad, obviously. Alright, so this is a instance in which I can clearly show how the Dorian mode sounds in relation to the Aeolian mode, also known as the minor scale. Okay, so in this instance, because of the presence of that major 4 chord and the 1 chord being minor, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. The chord progression was dictating that I was supposed to be playing the Dorian mode, not the Aeolian mode, okay? The chord progression always dictates what the lead guitar player is supposed to be doing. In this case, the chord progression is dictating the lead guitar player should be playing the Dorian mode, and that's what I was doing. Now let's expand this over the entire fretboard. Alright, so this is that Dorian mode, A Dorian, spanned over the entire fretboard. The brown notes that you see, or it's light brown, those all represent the note A, okay, and everything else in relation to A, which is my tonal center in this case, is of the A Dorian mode. Alright, now sometimes people may have some confusion when they try to play in a mode because they're used to playing in major scales and minor scales, and they don't want to have to go and learn a whole new scale over the entire fretboard, okay? And they especially don't want to have to learn 5 entire new scales because there's 5 other modes aside from major and minor. So a little trick that you can do is you can simply just think of this in terms as one of its relatives. Alright, so as I pointed out in the Intro to Modes lesson, every mode is relative to the other 6 modes, okay? So the relative of the A Dorian mode is the G major scale, also known as the G Ionian mode. Okay, so you see that pattern circled right there? That is your G major scale pattern. Okay, but you don't want to be thinking of this in terms of G because there's no G chord in here, okay? The patterns are the same. So if you're very fluent in soloing over the fretboard in the key of G major, okay, then you know the patterns. You know how the patterns relate to one another. Alright? But G is not your tonal center. So you don't want to be thinking G major. You want to be thinking A, and you want to be thinking A Dorian. But you can still use the patterns, okay? So the pattern here is always going to be related to the pattern right next to it, is always going to be related to the pattern right next to it in the same manner as the major scale. The only difference is the tonal center shifted. Now it's A, okay? Or if you're a guy that likes to think, or a guy or a girl that likes to think in terms of minor stuff, I know that when I play major keys, I tend to think in terms of relative minors. You can also view these patterns, okay, as the same patterns as the E minor scale. Okay, so up here you have your E minor scale pattern, okay, and then all of the patterns in relation to your E minor scale pattern. But again, there's no E minor in here. E is not your tonal center. This is not an E minor scale. This is A Dorian, but the patterns are the same. Okay, so if you're very good at soloing in E minor, and you know those patterns like the back of your hand, you can practically do them in your sleep. Well, then you know all the patterns for the A Dorian mode already, because it's a relative of that. But again, you're always going to be focusing on the A within these patterns. Alright? So, I don't want to keep rambling on about the same exact thing, but I know that there's a lot of confusion on modes, so I want to be as clear as possible about what they are, when they're supposed to be used, and just all that, okay? So that is, in a nutshell, what modes are and how to use the A Dorian mode. Okay, so now that we looked at this over the whole entire fretboard, let me just do another improv using the fretboard diagram, and you can see where I'm at as I'm soloing over each, or whatever position I'm at as I'm soloing over this chord progression. So let's hear how this sounds. Okay, so I was utilizing all those patterns that you saw on the fretboard. I was keeping my tonal center revolved around A, but all the patterns are the same. And I've spent my previous years getting very good at the major and minor scale, so I know the patterns like the back of my hand. I know, well, not like the back of my hand, but I know the patterns pretty well. And, the patterns are the same as that of the major or minor scale, just with the tonal center shift. Okay, so now the Dorian mode is 7 notes, okay? The pentatonic scale is 5 notes. Now the good thing about the Dorian mode is it works perfectly with the minor pentatonic, okay? Just like your natural minor scale works perfectly with the minor pentatonic scale, the only difference being 2 additional notes. The same thing applies for the Dorian mode and the pentatonic scale. Okay, so if you look at this fretboard diagram that's on the screen, you can see that within this Dorian mode, all of the notes of the A minor pentatonic are present. Okay, so the A minor pentatonic fits perfectly into the A Dorian mode. Therefore, your 5 pentatonic positions relative to the, relative to this one position of the A minor pentatonic scale, that will all work, okay? You won't be playing A Dorian anymore, because that omits that 6th degree, okay, that omits that one specific note that makes the Dorian, but it'll still work. Okay, so if you are finding yourself in an instance in which the Dorian mode would apply, and you don't quite feel comfortable with playing the Dorian mode yet, you can always revert back to what you do know. Probably, if you're on this lesson, you can always revert back to just doing your pentatonic stuff. Okay, so pentatonic and Dorian, or minor pentatonic and Dorian, they both work great with one another. Your tonal center is still A, the notes are still all contained there. But I find it best to get good at doing the Dorian and the pentatonic. That way you can kind of jump back and forth between the two to really spice up your playing. Okay, so let's just do a quick music example of how that might sound. Okay, so I'm going to start with pentatonic, and then I'm going to slowly start adding in the additional notes that make it the Dorian. Okay. Alright, so what I was doing there was I was attempting to highlight the fact that both the A minor pentatonic and the A Dorian can be used interchangeably with one another, okay, because all of the notes that are in the A minor pentatonic are also found within the A Dorian mode. Alright, I'm just simply eliminating 2 notes, that's it. The Dorian mode contains 7 notes, the pentatonic contains 5. Those 5 notes are all located within the Dorian mode. Alright, so if you're watching this video, which is a relatively advanced concept on modes, I'm sure you're by now familiar with the pentatonic scales. You're probably familiar with the 5 pentatonic positions. You're probably familiar with the sound of the pentatonic. Okay, so hopefully it was clear when I was just doing pentatonic stuff, and then hopefully it was clear when I was attempting to differentiate that by throwing in the additional notes which make it the Dorian mode. Okay, so that is going to be it for this lesson on the Dorian mode. Hopefully you were able to really hear the sound of the Dorian mode, which was my point. If you're confused with anything, if I left anything out, if you don't know the difference between relative modes and parallel modes, or anything is confusing you, feel free to ask and I'll get back to you. I do recommend that you read the written content under each of the lessons that I make, because I always link to other lessons, and I also explain the topic at hand pretty clearly. Okay, so if the videos don't clear it up for you and the written content underneath the videos don't clear it up for you, of course that only applies to website viewers. I don't put that written content on my YouTube videos. But if either of those things doesn't make sense to you, then feel free to hit me up and I'll do my best to answer your question. Okay, so stay tuned for part 3, which is the Phrygian mode. Alright, thanks a lot.